Hello everyone, I'm Paul Cheng. I think most of you know me, so I'll just dive right into it. So today, there's a big complicated title, but today what I'd like to talk to you about is demography, how it conditions the experience of family, and how race differences in one might be translated into race differences in the other. So to begin, I'd like to talk very broadly about the relationship between demography and family. And in order to do that, maths are complicated. Okay. So in order to do that, we might imagine an individual here represented by this lifeline. And we might think, so if this individual were to have a child at age 20, we might say that from that moment onward, they've transitioned into the kinship relation that we would call parenthood. Similarly, if that individual's parents had a child when the individual was 10 years old, well, from that moment on, that individual has transitioned into siblinghood. And so what I'd like to highlight here is how the fertility of not just the individual, but of related individuals signal transitions into different kinship or family relations. And not just births, but also deaths. So if the individual were to experience the death of a family member, a parent, at age 50, well, from that moment onward, they are an orphan. And so the overall point is how age-specific rates of mortality and fertility of individuals and their related kin really demarcate the transitions into and out of different kinship relations. And this is the kind of intuitive relationship between demography and family that I will rely on for the readers. Okay, so what if mortality and fertility patterns were to differ consistently between two populations? When the United States context, there probably is no two populations that are more dissimilar with regards to each of these factors than the black and white national populations. And so just to illustrate the point, what I've done here is plotted life expectancy at birth and total fertility rate by race. I'm sure most of you have seen these plots before. But the main patterns, the main pattern is the race gap that is pretty consistent throughout the last century, with some signs of convergence in more recent periods. Okay, so given these kind of persistent race gaps in mortality and fertility, what might the consequences be to the structure and the experience of black and white family? And so in order to answer this question, I operationalized this concept of Kinequality. And it's not just a catchy phrase, but it actually means something. And in broad terms, all it is the kind of mechanical relationship between differences in demography translated to differences in kinship. And the two components that I highlight are differences in kin availability and differences in familial life course expectations. And in the full paper, I go into much more detail about what each of those things mean, but for the present purposes, we can just think of it as differences in levels of kinship and differences in the sequences of kinship. The levels having to do with kind of at any particular moment in your life, what is your probability of being in a particular kinship relation, which again directly relates to who is available in your family network to make those kind of relational linkages with. And then the sequences have less to do with that, but more to do with kind of the ordering or the sequence or the trajectory of different kinship transitions over a lifetime. So how do we measure this? Unfortunately, it's really hard to do. There's no nationally representative kinship data that I know of, and if anybody does, please let me know. And I think the best we can do is to use the census data on familial households. The problem with using census data on familial households is that only family linkages that are measured within the household are observed. And so any kind of relational linkages that extend beyond the household boundary are missed. So to illustrate, if you were to look at the census and you observed a mother and a child living in the same household, without better information, you would conclude that this is a single-parent family. But what if that mother had a spouse who was living across the ocean working and sending back remittances? Well, then you would have missed that relational linkage. What if the child had an older sibling who was off in college, living in the dorms independently? You would have missed that linkage. What if the mother had adult siblings kind of heading their own households, and one of those households included the parent, the grandparent of the child? You would have missed all of those relational linkages. And so I argue that these types of, the household boundaries pose real serious kind of limitations to a satisfying measure of kind of kinship. And so how might we get around this issue? Well, I choose to do it using microsimulation. And I use the microsimulator SOCSIM, which was developed here at UC Berkeley, and it's maintained currently, I think, mostly by Carl. And so in a nutshell, what SOCSIM does is that it creates digital people in the machine, and then it trains their demographic behavior such that, on aggregate, it aligns with kind of age-specific mortality rates and age-specific fertility rates that we implement kind of sequentially in the machine. And so these digital people are kind of born, they reproduce, and then they die according to the rates that we've inputted. And at the end of the simulation, what we are left with is complete microdata on each of those individuals. And most crucially, for my purposes, what we have are individual or genealogical variables that allow us to kind of reconstruct the kinship networks kind of on the fly for any particular individual at any particular moment in simulated time. So very high resolution data that is almost purpose-built for the kind of measurements that I would like to do. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and dive into some results. And so just to orient you to this plot, this is a plot of average duration spent in different kinship relations. So 5 kinship relations here on the side. The black bars indicate the average durations for the black national population, and then the gray bars represent the average durations for the white national population. These numbers here on the side are the lifetime probabilities of ever having been in each of these relations for the average black and white American. And what else is there to say? Yes, and it's the x-axis is the age, so this is kind of the, over the course of an average individual's life, at what moment and for how long are they going to be in each of these different kinds of kinship relations. And so I'll give you guys a moment to just check that out. But I will, okay, well, I'd like to point out 3 kind of features, or 3 different race differences in these patterns. The first one is that the black population tends to transition into each of these kinship relations on average earlier. And this has a lot to do with kind of higher rates of fertility at earlier ages for the black population relative to the white population. Kind of the second race pattern is shorter duration, so once in these relations, the black population will spend fewer years in them, and this has a lot to do with higher rates of mortality at almost all ages for the black population. And then finally, the black population has lower lifetime probabilities of ever having inhabited these relations for most of these relations, and that has to do with kind of a complex interplay between the fertility and mortality patterns of black and white populations. So what this kind of summary plot is meant to represent is kind of living presence or living coexistence of kin. And in that sense, it's kind of a measure of the kin availability component that I was talking about earlier. What we're going to do now is we're going to shift gears and look at kind of the flip side of this, which is absence of kin. And the way we'll do that is by looking at the average age at which you first experience the death of different types of kin. So each of these bars represent kind of average lifelines, and the vertical lines mark the average age at which kin of different types, the death of those kin are experienced by the average black and white individual. And so the general pattern is that for the average black individual, most the distribution of kin death is kind of skewed left towards the earlier ages. And just to highlight a couple of the patterns, so the average black individual will experience the death of a parent around the age of 20, and that first death isn't experienced by the average white individual until about 8 years later. The gap is a little bit more stark for the first death of siblings, and of course this is because there are more black siblings at earlier ages. Shifting our perspective a little bit, if we were to just look at kind of the experience of kin death before the age of 21, kind of before you reach adulthood, we see that not in addition to grandparent death, the average black individual is expected to experience the death of also a sibling and a parent, all before they reach the age of 21. Okay, so this is a very kind of high in the clouds, kind of low resolution view of kin death over a lifetime. But our data allows us to go deeper. It allows us to find a resolution on kind of the moment-to-moment experience of kin death. And so what I have here is the probability of kin death calculated for each age. And at the top curve is the Black national curve, and the bottom curve is the white national population curve. And so this is the probability of experiencing the death of any one of those types of kin that I've listed there. And so the main story, of course, is that almost at every age until about the age of 55, the average Black individual is likely to experience more kin death. And if we were to enumerate that difference, it comes out to about 107% excess risk of death before the age of 50, which is the same thing as saying about twice as many kin deaths over that time. Oh, sorry. Okay, so we can even go further, and we can actually decompose each of these race-specific curves into their kin-specific components. And that's what you see here. And so the immediate thing to note is that not only does the probability of kin death differ in terms of its shape and levels, but also in its composition at each moment in time, or each moment in the
Can you read those?
Sure, yeah, there you go.
There you go.
So each of those bands represents kind of probability densities that are contributing to the overall probability curves, the race-specific probability curves. And just to put a little perspective on this, if we were to look again at those at the deaths occurring in the pre-adult years up until age 21, we notice that about a fifth of those deaths in the white population are due to the death of siblings and children, whereas only a third in the Black population are of siblings and children. Those deaths that are experienced. Okay, so I'd just like to finish on two concluding thoughts. One is that in this project, I've relied on a definition of kinship that is wholly consanguineous. But of course, we all know that family is not just biology, but also affinity. You know, the members of our community, our friends, all of those folks can serve in kind of familial roles for us. But I would claim that kinship defined by consanguinity, as I've done here, crucially defines kind of the genealogical boundaries within which those kind of family negotiations must take place. And second point is that throughout the last century, these kind of genealogical boundaries have been far more constrained for Black Americans than for white Americans. And it's really this difference in that type of constraint that I call Kinequality. Thank you very much.
How much time left?
That was 12 minutes and 40 seconds.
Okay, you got it.
I have a question about the first charts you have about the timing of entry and duration in black and white in different statuses. What if you did that separately for males and females? Particularly becoming a parent, I mean, you'd expect substantial differences between the age at which women become parents and men and so on. Is it possible to do a sex-specific
It's
analysis?
definitely possible, yes. There's definitely information in the data sets.
Yeah, because it might make quite a difference. You might find differences between, you might find some significant interaction effects between race and gender, right?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, definitely. I should definitely.
Something to do.
I didn't understand this graph at all.
Okay.
And one of the things is, I didn't understand what the 0.63 was and the 0.47. I didn't understand. I mean, once you're a grandparent, aren't you always a grandparent?
So this is it, being born in that population. What is your chance of ever being a grandparent?
Yeah.
So 63% of whites have a chance of ever being a grandparent.
Yes.
Okay, so the 63 doesn't have anything to do with the length of the...
Sorry, yeah, no, I should.
Okay,
Yeah.
so that was why, because the lines are labeled, and I was thinking, why do the length of the... So the lines actually represent, on average, periods
Yeah.
in which you're in that state. And then the numbers refer to the probability. Okay, I got it. Okay.
But thank you, yeah.
Why don't you say that on the slide somewhere?
Yeah.
You did say it when you...
Yeah, but I can definitely label it so that it's much clearer. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
I have a question about I think it's the next graph. No, yeah, this one.
So if I look at the back border, the S here is about around 16, age 16. Does it mean that for the black population, on average, they'd be 16 years old when they lose one sibling?
The first time they lose a sibling.
So is that related to the fact that fertility is higher among blacks, so the age difference between the siblings, the external difference would be higher, or is it because of really high mortality? I mean, I guess
It's both.
combination.
It's definitely both. Yeah, the denominator is higher because there are more siblings, but also the rates of mortality are higher at those early ages.
Seems like okay.
Yes, Josh.
On this graph, the siblings do not make sense to me, that the average age which we lose a sibling is 27 or 17. When you showed your consumption graph where you had the densities, the average was also something like 50. So
Oh, you mean
maybe I'm misinterpreting this, but it just doesn't seem believable on the face of it that the average person loses a sibling in their 20s and 30s.
This is
Here on
different.
this graph, we see
Yeah.
it's roughly uniform distribution across the whole life, so
Well, it's the first time that you would lose a sibling, and those right. So
whites are gonna have one sibling,
right.
pretty much.
Yeah.
and so.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
I
it's-
just don't see how it can be that.
if we look on this graph, the
Mhm.
whites, the average of the whites is something like 67 years old. If I just put that down. Anyway, it just doesn't seem right to me. So I think you must be calculating different numbers, so you need to tell us what the number
Okay.
is.
I will definitely go back.
But here you have if you have like 10 siblings, here they're all represented.
Mhm.
When you previous graph, it's only the first day, right?
Right.
So I think.
Yeah, I think they're. But you're right. If it's confusing, I should clarify that point.
I find myself wondering, is this conditional on one dying? What is the average age at which the sibling died? Just more on what Josh was saying.
And I think the big point that is not being said here is that the mortality differences get multiplied. So maybe one way to motivate this would be to show us that the two survival curves where there's visible difference but not huge differences, and everyone asks how does that translate, and that will, I think,
In the full paper that I do.
yeah, but I think I still would start, because it's a demographic question.
Mhm.
Your paper's really a demographic paper, and at the beginning when you're talking, we don't quite know where it's going to go. Are you going to go into the emotional experience of losing kin? Are you going to go into illegitimacy and things like that? And so if we kind of set us up early that here's what we all know, but we don't know what this means in terms of kinship, then it just helps us know what's coming.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions? Ms. Leon?
Just a small add-on. I also found the age of parental death to be surprisingly low, the average age at which,
For the first
just
step.
knowing the overall life expectancy and all these people have survived to parenthood. And so it's surprising. And so I think just along the same lines of the discussion of siblings, I also feel like the age at which people are expected to lose a parent
Yeah.
is surprisingly young. So I would just try to map those onto what people might already have in their heads about life expectancy.
Yeah.
And if they're surprisingly low, just talk about why
Yeah.
the simulations generate that.
Is part of the problem that we should add 21 years to these numbers?
No. No. No.
Okay. Yeah, I say you don't.
And I know it seems young, but if you actually look at the literature, that these numbers kind of do conform. It's younger than you would expect, and I think a lot of that has to do with kind of our selection of folks here. Yes.
Do you have in your paper, because you're using simulation, so could you just, to figure out how to disentangle the effect of mortality and fertility, could you fix the mortality and then just vary fertility and see how much
Yeah,
difference
then that's
it
how
makes?
I did that, and that's how I was able to make the comments about why you see the differences and kind of transitions and
So that-
divisions.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's useful.
I just want to make sure I understand this one more time, and
Sure.
that is that I see the first grandparent
Mhm.
death in both cases to be around 10. In my particular, and I'm just trying to get this straight in my mind,
Yeah.
these are conditional on a grandparent being alive at your birth,
No,
Okay, so
no, yeah.
of my 4 grandparents, 3 died before I was born. So what would, 1 died when I was like 20. Okay, so I had 3 who died way before I was born, and I had 1 who died when I was 20. What is my average age at which my grandparents?
So that's a good question. It is the first time you experience the death of grandparents. So
It's conditional on the grandparent
right,
dying
yeah,
after your
born,
birth.
you're right. Yes,
Okay,
yes,
that was,
yeah,
okay,
yeah.
okay.
We better go.
Let's talk. We have a